Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Aaron DeVore, and I'm Chair in Transgender Studies, and I am your host for today. We always start at University of Victoria with a respectful territorial acknowledgement, and so we acknowledge with respect to the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So we're very pleased to be here, and we're very pleased that you could join us. So I wanted to say a bit about us, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today. So Chair in Transgender Study is the world's first chair in transgender studies, and it works to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people and our allies everywhere. We contribute to the development and the communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people that can be used to build better policies and better laws and to drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts, cultural, and social activities. And in all that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. One of the main things that we do is the Transgender Archives, and we are celebrating our 10th year in existence. As you saw, we started in 2011. And since then, we have been honored to be able to assist students, community members, academic researchers, community researchers, members of the general public to find out more about the history of trans plus people. So this year, we're having a number of different events and celebrations. And so we want you to be part of it and watch over the coming year for a special 10-year anniversary content from us. If you're not on our mailing list, please go to our website and sign up so that you can hear about everything that's coming up. Another big piece of what we do at the chair is the Moving Trans History Forward conferences, where we build community by sponsoring these international and interdisciplinary gatherings. They happen every 2 years. The next one is in March 2023, and I encourage all of you to stay tuned for that and sign up and join us. And if you're interested in what we've done in the past, we have a YouTube channel with lots of videos on it, including videos from past conferences. And then briefly, a couple of the other things we do is we have a scholarships and fellowships program, scholarships for UVic students, fellowships for visitors, and our application process for the 2022 awards will be opening shortly. So again, watch our newsletter, our social media for more information about that. And then periodically we put on various arts and cultural events, such as art gallery exhibitions. We've had performance artists, film screenings, and social events. Okay, so now to the main event of today. Our speaker is Sachi Tsuruta, who will be speaking about creating transgender identity maps in Japan. There's Sachi, hi. And Sachi is a sociology and gender studies associate professor at Chiba University in Greater Tokyo, Japan. She's also a scholar in residence at UVic's Chair in Transgender Studies for 1 year. And she's doing field work, or has done field work and interview research with Japanese trans communities for 2 decades. So Sachi is an experienced researcher in this area. So in this talk, Sachi will draw on Trans Plus Identity Words Map from their decades of long research, interview research with trans plus people in Japan, using their own words and examining it from an ethno-methodological and conversational analysis point of view. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sachi now to tell you about their research.
Hello, my name is Sachi Tsuruta. My preferred pronouns are she or they. I come from Japan and I am an associate professor at Chiba University in Greater Tokyo, Japan. I teach gender studies, sexuality studies, qualitative research, and sociology in medicine at my university. Today, I will talk about creating transgender identity maps in Japan and EMCA analysis of interview data. This is same as Aaron. We acknowledge with respect the Rakwagan people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Sanghees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. Let me begin by giving you an outline of my presentation. This talk will be done in 4 main parts. First, I will talk a little bit about Japan, especially gender in Japan. Next, we will move on to my research and methods. The third part is how to draw transgender category maps in Japan, and is also made up of 3 parts. My data was gathered from interview with trans people in Tokyo. First, I will talk about the terminology used around the 2000s in the Japanese trans community. TS is an abbreviation of a transsexual known as TS in Japan. TS people differentiate TS from transgender by arguing the difference between what we do and what they do. Second, I will talk about a category map from the 2010s. GID, or gender identity disorder, a medical term in DSM and ICD, is also a kind of gender identity in Japan. Third, we will look at current terminology in Japan. These days, in Japan, transgender is used with almost the same meaning as in North America. I will talk about similarities among the categories transgender, exgender, feminist, and GID as identity categories in the sense that they all oppose binary gender order. Exgender is almost the same as non-binary in North America. And the last part is about the research that I am doing now. For the first part, I will talk about Japan with the focus on gender in Japan. British Columbia is 2.5 times larger than Japan. Japan is a relatively small country. But the Japanese population is large. For example, the population of metropolitan Tokyo is more than all of Canada. The first picture is of a toy store in Japan. Most of the boys' toys are blue and most of the girls' toys are pink. The 2 spots are separate in the store. The gender appearance of women and men in Japan is highly differentiated. These are backpacks for elementary school students. Almost all Japanese elementary school students use this kind of backpack. The black one is for boys and the red one is for girls. They will use the same bags for about 6 years. Most high schools have uniforms. On the left is the sailor style and the right is the blazer style. Cisgender students don't have a choice. Women have to wear skirts and men have to wear pants. Nowadays, trans men students have choose pant style uniforms, while trans women can choose skirt style uniforms. However, at some schools, but not all schools, non-binary students have a right to choose. Those kind of students who want to choose pants or skirts first need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from a psychiatrist. Occupation depends on gender. In this picture, the doctor is a man and the nurse is a woman. This is a stock photo, and stock photos are made for commercial use, but they can help us understand the traditional and stereotyped gender roles. Gender appearance in the workplace is very differentiated too. The word for pain and the word for shoes sound the same in Japanese. Futsu. Some companies still have rules which force women to wear high heels. However, many women are now rebelling against the rules. Futsu is the name of the rebellion against being forced to wear high heels at work. Futsu is a play on Me Too. The gender balance is not good in Japan. The Japanese cabinet includes only 3 women out of its 20 members. The age balance is pretty bad too. Trans people in Japan live in that kind of very binary and unfair society. And this is the law regarding changing gender on one's ID in Japan. If someone wants to change their gender, it is necessary to get a diagnosis of having gender identity disorder by 2 or more psychiatrists and have to be not less than 20 years of age, not currently married, because Japan doesn't have a same-sex marriage law, and one must currently have no child who is a minor and has to have bottom surgery. It means they have to be infertile. This means this Japanese law is a human rights problem and there is no non-binary ID. Next is about my research. I have been researching interactions among the trans community in Tokyo, Japan, for over 2 decades. I do this by recording conversations and interview and analyzing them. I have conducted 46 interviews with 40 trans people, each about 2 hours long. The data I am presenting to you today was gathered from these interviews. My methodology is called ethnomethodology. It is an orthodox methodology used to treat transgender phenomena. Ethnomethodology is the sociological study which describes how people construct the reality of the everyday world in and through interaction, especially conversation. So I will analyze interview data from the viewpoint of how interviewees use trans identity categories and how those categories have changed in the past 2 decades. The Agnes paper is my favorite paper about transgender. In it, Garfinkel interviewed a trans woman who was called Agnes and analyzed the gender binary in society. He pointed out before Foucault and Judith Butler how gender is socially constructed. And Kessler is a donator to the Transgender Archive at UBIC. Kessler and McKenna had great respect for Garfinkel's work and illustrated how people recognize the difference between women and men by interviewing trans people. I would like to recommend the paper Doing Gender. It is in the book The Transgender Studies Reader First Edition and was published before Judith Butler's Undoing Gender. West and Zimmerman pointed out how people are doing being woman or man in interaction through their acts and interactions in everyday life. My research question is, how are the similarities and differences between trans categories accountable in trans phenomena? And how do trans people account for themselves with those similarities and differences? The people I interviewed use many identity words, and these words are essential to explain how the language has changed over time. So I will use the language they used, and I have to use those words, even though I understand that in North America at this time, these words are not generally used. In Japan, people use trans English terms in Japanese, but the meanings are slightly different. Kate Bonstein said, to embrace those people, myself included, I borrowed the word transgender. But in many circles today, the word has become simply another word for transsexual. So in my country, the newer and more inclusive word is simply trans. The way of gender in a living, changing path like a river. Trans people in Japan talk about how categories they use to resemble each other or differ. They are creating the conceptual maps of trans identity categories. This is one of the distinctive features of transgender phenomena in which many new categories are born one after another. The maps are rewritten each time new categories arise. So, what I present today will seem familiar to North American trans people too. Let's start with my data on the terminology around the 2000s and the practice of using trans identity categories in Japan. This is about transsexual fundamentalism in Japan. Trans people in Japan use English words to refer to themselves. For example, transgender, transsexual, TS, TG are pronounced as transgender, transsexual, TS, TG. This is a diagram of terminology around the 2000s. English words for gender identity categories have been imported to Japan, and all English words are used in English in the Japanese context. There are no native Japanese words for these terms, though they are used with Japanese pronunciation. Furthermore, for example, transsexual and TS are the same in North America, but Japanese people love the shorter version of the term, so people in Japan usually use TS. First, I will explain the terminological background. The words TS, transsexual, TV, transvestite, and TG, transgender, began to appear in early 1990s. Transgender has two meanings. Transgender in a narrow sense of the term means trans people who don't desire bottom surgery but want to change their gender expression for passing. Transgender in a wider sense of the term includes TS, TG narrow sense, and TV, as in Western countries. Usually, TG refers to the narrow sense. TB means cross-dresser, the same as in North America. The category set transgender in a wider sense of the term was the broadest category set of the trans community in the 2000s. The category set GID includes TS and TG in a narrow sense, and the category set transgender in a wider sense of the term includes both of them and TB. This is cover my book in the upper right corner. In 1997, the mass media reported Saitama Medical University applied to the ethics committee to start performing sex reassignment surgeries. Since then, the concept of GID has become known to the public through mass media. TS and TG became subcategories of GID, with true TS on the top and per-time TV on the bottom of a hierarchy that mainly emerged in online trans communities. In the community, people who wanted to be a member of the TS or TG category needed to understand how to use the categories. Through mass media, many transgender in a wider sense of the term knew about transgender and they began to identify themselves as trans. Accordingly, in online trans communities, many trans people began to talk about themselves as being trans. In this time, I will introduce B's story. B is a trans woman who was around the age of 30 in 2000. This slide is a quote from an interview. I was a newcomer into the trans community around the 2000s. So what we see here is me explaining the phenomenon of being trans to me, a newcomer. And she explained the reason why she doesn't say that she is TS to others. This transcript starts with the second reason for that. Before the quotation of this slide, B shows why she doesn't call herself TS and explains the first reason is that she pays attention to the debate or controversy around who is true TS. From her explanation, we can understand that being a true TS is to sacrifice the whole of one's life for their transition. But I can't show you the transcript because B was concerned that she may have quoted what the other transgender activists said. Let's move on to the second reason in this slide. There are two quote slides. In this quotation, B talks about a kind of phobia with which B herself also has. That is, a sense that there are some people who are by no means TS. He mentions various things which constitute that sense, such as their experience, posture, their way of speaking, or how they have relationships with others, etc. Thus, B reports the mood of the 2000s in which she couldn't say I am TS without having all such things. This is another account and the second reason why she doesn't say that she is TS to others. In reply to B's account, the interviewer shows her understanding that passing is the point of B's story. B aligns with the understanding and sums up her story with the expression of that may be the biggest problem for TS people. Passing means trying to present a no doubt gender experience as the gender one feels. At the time, many trans people were pursuing passing, and passing was the focus of the conversation in the interviews. The summary of this story is like this. B shows why she doesn't call herself TS. Reason 1, she pays attention to the debate or controversy of who is true TS. Reason 2, there are some people who are not regarded as TS in other TS people's sense. Next is the story around the 2010s. The practice of treating GID as an identity category, the same as transgender. This is an identity category map around the 2010s. GID as an identity category and transgender as an identity category did not have a very different meaning at that time in some trans communities. I want to talk about the background of the data. On the one hand, the relation between GID and transgender is like oil and water. Oil and water can't mix. GID means gender identity disorder. It was a medical term in DSM and ICD. Because transgender is the name given by a human rights movement, while GID is the name of the disease that the movement has struggled against. Transgender people have tried to stop the use of transgender people have tried to stop the use of gender transition as a disease. So those two terms has opposing meaning for transgender people in the Western world and within trans activism in Japan. But on the other hand, GID and identity category used in Japan, it is used in a depathologized way among trans people in Japan. I would like to introduce Dee's story in 2010. Dee is a trans woman in the central part of the island of Honshu. Here are 2 more slides. Interviewer T is me, says people with GID say something like, I was a man, but from now on, I am a woman and I forget that I was a man. Transgender people, those who have a past as a man and who will be living as a woman, and from that viewpoint, T thinks D is a transgender. So T says, you are transgender, aren't you? In line 132. It means this identity is not mentioned by the interviewee, but by the interviewer. He resists this, saying, oh, am I? In line 133. O implies she isn't aware of that, and that is new information for her, because O is a change of state marker by Compensation Analysis Heritage, 1984. T laughs because of awkwardness, in line 134. D has a negative reaction against that. So T changes the question formulation. You don't have empathy for transgender people, in line 138. D denies T's question twice. Actually, I do, and explain what she thinks. Then it is clear that D thinks GID and transgender are not so different. The summary of this story is the interviewer's presupposition is that GID and transgender are different. D denies that presupposition and shows her understanding that GID and transgender do not oppose each other. Thus, D can identify herself as GID with sympathy for identity category of transgender. The third analysis is about the commonality between GID, transgender, X-gender, and feminist in recent trans terminology in Japan. X-gender has almost the same meaning as non-binary currently has in North America. The interviewee shows an understanding that all of them challenge the binary gender order, though the ways they do it are different. This is a gender identity category map around 2020s. The category set called against gender binary includes GID and transgender, as well as X-gender and feminist in my data. This is a quote from B's second interview. In 2000, she talked about the true TS story. At this time, she is talking about identity category in the current trans community. She is currently a trans woman activist. In excerpt N21, T is me, and I remind B of the topic B was talking about before, whether GID or transgender is more critical of the existing gender order. Though B admits that there is a nuance that transgender is more critical, B asserts that both are critical. B explains why we can see both as the same by saying that the border blurs anyway. And she evokes that name of very famous feminist queer theorist Judith Butler. Her book, Gender Turbo, is the queer theorist Bible. Thus, B shows an understanding that both GID and transgender share a common feature from the feminist viewpoint. This is a continuation of the excerpt N21. Next, I will present more detailed data. Talk between dollar symbols is smiling while talking. B has said that GID and transgender have a common feature in the both say something against gender order. Here, B begins to talk about the way in which GID and transgender blow the gender order similar to the theory of Judith Butler, a leading feminist philosopher who argue how gender is socially constructed. In sum, B talks about the close relationship between transgender and hard feminism. In line 1, by saying in this sense, B focuses on a certain aspect of the previous talk and topicalized feminism by mentioning the name of Butler. In the course of this side story, B and T share two things. First, though B doesn't talk about what Butler says, he shows B's understanding of the content of what Butler says. So B and T share what Butler says. They confirm this mutual understanding in line 3 and 4. The second involves the difficulty of Butler's terminology and discussions. B, on the one hand, insists that what Butler says is right. On the other hand, she says she has not read Butler thoroughly. Thus, she weakens her assertion. In line 6, she suggests a reason why B has not read Butler thoroughly, that is, Butler is difficult to read. Sharing the difficulty of reading Butler is common among academic feminists in Japan. So, B doesn't mean she reads Butler carelessly. Rather, she says she reads Butler in a feminist way. In doing so, she is doing being a feminist. Indeed, B confirms the reason which T gives and T laughs in line 8. He also laughs and mentions a point of difficulty and T laughs again. Here, B and T share features of the story. That is, the talk of the difficulty of reading Butler is so common among feminists that it's not a serious problem, but a laughing matter. In doing so, B and T share the experience and difficulty of trying to read Butler as a feminist. After that, we return to the original topic from this side story. There are 2 quote slides. Please focus on the text in red. In excerpt N24, the continuation of the original topic, he says X-gender also challenged the gender order, though the ways they do so are different from GID and transgender. The last quote in excerpt N21, B states there are many ways to cross the border, but the border blurs at those times anyway. And in this quote, B says FTX and non-binary are also critical of the order. The way in which they bump into the order is different. FTX means female to X gender. X gender is non-binary in North American English terminology. Here, B treats FTX and X gender as categories which have a similar function with GID and transgender in that they are critical of the binary gender order. And interviewer T, that is say some people who say the transgender is just changing a sex category. And I add, those kinds of people just see only the outcome, so they cannot understand what is there in the process of transition. After I mention some people who see only the outcome, B expresses her idea about how they are wrong. B talks about how her life blurs the gender order with example of how she is treated when she shows her male ID card at the hospital counter. In Japan, as I showed before, changing ID is complex for trans people. Thus, B shows her understanding that transgender, exgender, GID, and feminist challenge the gender binary in their own ways. In conclusion of analysis, the international community, GID is rarely, if ever, used as an identity category. Transsexual is used instead, but the usage of transsexual is becoming less frequent. On the other hand, GID has been frequently used in Japan as an identity category, but its meaning has been depathologized. Presently, however, GID is being used less often, while many people are using transgender. The map of identities and terminology is constantly changing with the experience and usage of the people. When trans people refer to themselves with various categories such as GID, GS, GG, etc., they talk about what those categories are and how they resemble each other or differ. In sum, they are creating the conceptual maps of trans identity categories. This is one of the distinctive features of transgender phenomena in which many new categories are born one after another. The maps are rewritten each time new categories arise. Today, I try to show one of those ways in order to illustrate the complexity of such a phenomenon. Finally, let's move on to my next steps in the research. Since 2018, I have been attempting to make an online oral history archive like the Trader Transgender Oral History Project at the University of Minnesota, the New York City Trans Oral History Project at the New York City Library, or the Transgender Oral History Project that Aaron is doing. To do this, I obtained 2 grants. One is the research grant program, Practical Research to Archive Oral Records of Sexual and Gender Minority Movements using Toyota funds. The other is Transformation of Gender from the Non-Binary Viewpoint, sponsored by Grant in Aid for Scientific Research called Kakenhi by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, JSPS, in the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, NEXT. The starting point was the thoughts that I have had while doing research over the last 10 years or so. My first thought was when I have written papers about trans people and have quotes from their interviews while keeping them anonymous, I wonder if this constitutes exploitation of them, their experience, and the community. In the past 2 decades, trans people have become more visible than before, with many activists appearing in Japan. Additionally, I obtained a grant in Japan to interview trans activists. However, activists started to think that if sociological research treats them as anonymous, it shows that they are not being respected. My second thought was my papers were read by a limited number of people who can understand my papers, only scholars. In this 2 exploitation, because I usually don't write journalistic papers, I just write research papers and very slowly at that. My first thought was, I wonder if by keeping trans people anonymous makes them feel their existence is something that needs to be anonymous because their experience is seen by society as deviant. I hope that society changes to be more trans inclusive and more diverse. Although EMCA describes the binary gender order because society is in actuality stereotypical. Describing social norms is the job of EMCA. However, I want to take it a step further to the society that I hope will exist in the future. If I am able to create oral history archive, firstly, everybody will be able to watch the interviews. For example, members of the community, allies, or scholars, anyone. Secondly, the data will become part of history, especially those from activists. If so, it will empower new activists in the community. Furthermore, I will no longer have to keep secrets about the interviews until even after I die, because once I complete my interviews and analyze the data in the archives, the information will be publicly available. So I have studied to make those archives. The first one is from 2019, the LGBTQ plus oral history archive project sponsored by Toyota Funds in Japan. That is as follows. In recent years in Japan, the LGBT issue has become increasingly visible and society is becoming more tolerant of sexual and gender minorities. This change has not come out of nowhere. Rather, it is a manifestation of long-standing efforts by minorities and allies. Unfortunately, the history of these movements remains relatively unknown, even amongst the people who lead current activities. As a result, this study aimed to collect and archive oral records on sexual and gender minority movements via interviews with activists who have engaged in relevant movements over the course of many years. It also seeks to pave the way for publicizing this information after paying careful attention to protecting personal information. The publication of these oral records will enable the history of sexual and gender minority movements to be preserved and succeeded by subsequent generations. Our project team consists of social scientists who have engaged in empirical research on sexual and gender minorities issues, with each member being an expert in interview research methodology. By utilizing the personal connection that we have cultivated, we choose informants with whom we will conduct research interviews in the field of lesbian, gay, and transgender studies. We will focus on the intersectionality of their lives and narrative of solidarity. However, as I'll talk about later, the first project had many difficulties that needed to be overcome in order to be created in Japan. So I started the second project in Canada, and I'm trying to bring back the experience of creating an archive to Japan. That is the Transclass Identity Words Archive project. The research seeks to draw transclass identity category maps and describe what gender categories transclass people use themselves in recent Canadian society, as well as answer a number of questions. How do interviewees use transclass identity categories in their everyday life and local activism in Canada? What is non-binary, or how is non-binary different from genderqueer or other categories? In sum, what gender binary to them? I am conducting interviews, analyzing the data, and publishing papers with those kinds of research questions in mind. The interview data will be stored in the Transgender Archive at UB. Next, I will introduce ethical reviews in Japan and what problem the Toyota Fund project has. At first, there was no consensus that it was necessary to submit an ethics application for the Toyota Fund project in my research team. This is because not having an ethics reviews is still okay in Japan. Nonetheless, I decided to submit our ethics application to my university department. However, my department ethics board didn't have any experience checking an archive project application. Because of that, the board gave up on giving approval to archive projects, although they gave approval to archiving research. Furthermore, they said it was not an issue covered by the ethics review in academia. So we had to seek other ways to protect participants and researchers. Therefore, the issue is that if problems occur, what can participants and researchers do? On the other hand, ethical reviews in Canada are different from in Japan. Everyone who needs to do research in Canada needs to apply to the university's ethics board. In fact, I wrote over 30 pages for the procedure for my Transverse Identity Words Archive project. I started writing it in early May, and my application was approved on September 10th. In total, I completed the application form, consent form, interview guide, recruitment letter, and letter of information. After the process, the university will protect the member of the research, both interviewees in the research and people who are conducting the research. Additionally, my faculty's ethics board is run by professors who work voluntarily, whereas UVic's ethics board has some full-time staff. The system of the ethics review of Canada is much more useful and organized. The interviewee may donate data to the archive. If they don't donate the data, that means they don't want to be part of the data archive. However, I don't think the concept of donating data is familiar to Japanese people in Japan. Therefore, the team of Toyota Funds will need to use different technique from my Canadian project to complete our project. Therefore, the Toyota Funds team continues to consider how an oral history archive can be realized in Japan. In conclusion, I consider it's necessary to have an institution like the Transgender Archives at UVic so that the data in the archive can be taken care of over a long period of time. This is needed to be able to realize the archive. I will endeavor to have a similar institution at some university in Japan in the future. At the present, I am conducting interviews online for the first time because of the COVID, and in English as a non-native English speaker with trans people in Canada, and even if I am struggling a bit, and I am continually gaining valuable experience in the formation of my own online history archive. Then, I intend to bring back that experience to Japan to realize these plans in the future. So finally, I would like to thank Aaron and Michael who helped me to come here to visit the chair in Transgender Studies and the Transgender Archives at UVic. Also, I would like to thank my colleagues at Chiba University in Japan. Thank all of you for your kind attention.